From a young age, she had been forced to grow up quickly, taking on responsibilities that no child should ever face. By 19, she found herself a single mother to a beautiful son named Lucas. Lucas was now 6 years old, a bright and energetic little boy with a smile that could light up the darkest of rooms. As her son grew, so did his needs, and with it, the mountain of bills that seemed to rise higher with each passing day. She was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Her days were filled with worry and regret, replaying every decision she had made, wondering how things had come to this point. She tried to search for a glimmer of hope, but it always seemed just out of reach. On the small kitchen table, next to a loaf of stale bread, sat an advertisement that her neighbor had left earlier that morning. Demanding work, excellent salary, seeking discretion and commitment. Could this be her chance? For a moment, her heart skipped a beat. She wondered if someone like her, with a life full of struggles, even stood a chance. But then her gaze fell to the second line of the ad. Excellent salary. A better salary meant a better school for Lucas, a house with a garden where he could play, and no more sleepless nights wondering if she would have enough money to keep the lights on. Khloe's fingers trembled as she held the ad in her hands, weighing her options. Or it could be the beginning of a new set of challenges. She took a deep breath and decided to take the leap. Everything about this place felt otherworldly. She had never seen anything like it before. Her heart raced as she stepped onto the property, feeling both excited and nervous. What was she doing here? But the thought of securing a better future for Lucas pushed all doubts aside. A housekeeper named Lucy greeted her at the door with a polite smile. "I'll take you to Mr.
Foster. Just be honest with him."
As she followed Lucy through the silent hallways, Khloe couldn't help but feel small in such an extravagant place. The house was unlike anything she had ever seen, grand, elegant, and eerily quiet. Every room seemed meticulously maintained, with fresh flowers placed in each corner. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, but it was his eyes that stood out the most. Cold, analytical, almost challenging. Khloe swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. Arthur tilted his head slightly, eyeing her closely. "Why do you want this job?" Khloe took a deep breath. She had to be honest, especially if she wanted this chance. "I'm a single mother," she began, "and I want to secure a better future for my son." Arthur remained silent for a moment, as if weighing her words. The tension in the room was thick, but after what seemed like an eternity, he gave a brief motion of his hand. "Start tomorrow. Don't disappoint me." She had done it, but as she stepped out of the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to Arthur Foster and this job than met the eye. Later that night, as she tucked Lucas into bed, Khloe felt her heart tighten with worry. She had made this choice for him, but now the weight of what she had committed to began to settle in. Tomorrow would bring a new set of challenges, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for them. But for Lucas, she would do whatever it took. It was still early, the sun barely peeking through the curtains. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. She was going to work for a millionaire. She had to make this work. Her fingers brushed through her messy hair as she pulled herself out of bed. Lucas was still asleep, curled up in his blankets with his favorite stuffed bear clutched tightly in his arms. For a fleeting moment, Khloe considered waking him up to say goodbye, but she stopped herself. She moved through her morning routine with practiced speed, making breakfast, packing her small bag, and putting on the clothes she had carefully chosen the night before. The dress was simple, a soft, beige blouse and black trousers, something that said, "I'm professional, but not out of place." She took one last look at her reflection in the mirror before grabbing her things and heading out the door. When Khloe arrived at the mansion, Lucy greeted her once again. This time, however, Lucy's demeanor was less formal, but the same cool efficiency was evident in her every movement. "Come in, I'll show you to Mr. Foster's office," Lucy said, leading Khloe through the quiet, opulent hallways. The silence in the house was deafening, the only sound the echo of their footsteps against the marble floors. "Mr. Your main responsibility will be assisting him with his daily needs, including bathing and dressing. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she signed up for the job, but this felt different. Vulnerable. She had no idea what Arthur Foster's needs entailed or how much of her personal boundaries she would have to sacrifice. But the thought of securing a better future for Lucas kept her focused. They arrived at the master bedroom, and Lucy opened the door. Inside was Arthur, sitting in his wheelchair, his posture straight and rigid, even though he had every right to slouch. His sharp eyes immediately locked onto Khloe's, appraising her as though he were examining a piece of fine art. "Are you the candidate?" Arthur's voice was low and clipped, cutting through the stillness of the room. "Yes, sir," Khloe replied, trying to sound confident despite the tight knot forming in her stomach. Arthur didn't answer immediately. Khloe's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, ready to do what she had been hired for. She learned that he was meticulous. Everything had to be done in a specific order, and there was no room for error. He liked things quick and efficient, but he also valued discretion and professionalism. When it was time for Khloe to assist Arthur with his bath, she felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. And yet, here she was, standing in front of a man who had more money than she could ever imagine, preparing to help him bathe. Arthur wheeled himself into the master bathroom, a space designed to accommodate his wheelchair. The space was a far cry from Khloe's modest apartment, and she couldn't help but feel out of place. As she adjusted the shower bench so that Arthur could transfer from his wheelchair, she noticed the scars on his hands. Arthur didn't ask for help, but his body spoke volumes. Khloe stood nearby, ready to assist if needed, but he seemed determined to do everything on his own. "Don't treat me like an invalid," Arthur said suddenly, his voice sharp, breaking the silence. "I just want to ensure your safety." Arthur scoffed but didn't respond. The rest of the bath was conducted in silence, broken only by the sound of running water. Arthur didn't say anything, but his eyes followed her every movement. "You seem to be handling this well," Arthur remarked, his tone not quite a compliment, but more like a test. The rest of the day passed in a blur of instructions from Lucy and moments where Khloe felt like she was walking on eggshells, afraid to make a mistake. As she was tidying up the rooms, Lucas called from the neighbor's phone, his cheerful voice offering a brief moment of relief in an otherwise overwhelming day. "Is the house big?" "I miss you, Mommy," Lucas said softly. Khloe's heart ached. She missed him more than anything, but she couldn't show weakness. She had to stay strong for him. "I miss you too, my love," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm doing this for us. We'll be together soon. Now make sure to go to bed early, okay?" The days that followed felt like a blur for Khloe. It was hard to ignore how different everything was compared to her life before. The mansion was beautiful, but it felt like a gilded cage. Arthur, despite his cold demeanor, was more than just a millionaire. He was a puzzle, a mystery that Khloe felt compelled to understand. But there were boundaries. She knew not to pry too much into his life, especially not with the shadows of his past hovering over him. The evenings were often the hardest. After a long day of work, the silence of the mansion would fall over her like a weight. "Mommy, when are you coming home?" Lucas' voice was always filled with innocent joy, but lately, Khloe heard a hint of longing that she wasn't used to. The job was paying well, but it came with its own complications. And now there were the threats, those mysterious notes that had started appearing around the house. They were unsettling, and Khloe couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow tied to Evelyn. The housekeeper, Lucy, had always been polite, but Khloe could see the concern in her eyes. She had started to notice the tension building between Arthur and Evelyn, and it wasn't hard to guess that the housekeeper wasn't exactly fond of her. Evelyn's not someone you want to cross. She's always scheming. Khloe had tried to brush it off, but deep down, she knew Lucy was right. Evelyn was a force to be reckoned with. The way she looked at Khloe, the way she always seemed to hover around Arthur, it was clear that Evelyn wanted something more than just to be a helpful assistant. She had been sent to organize his paperwork and make sure everything was in order, but there was an unease in the air, an undercurrent that she couldn't quite place. Arthur was at his desk, flipping through some documents. His wheelchair was positioned so that he could see the sunlight filtering in from the large windows, but his expression was anything but peaceful. Khloe froze, her fingers stilling on the paper in front of her. "Sir, you're doing your job, yes, but there's something more to you." Khloe's heart skipped a beat. This was not the cold, distant man she had come to know. The walls he had built up over the years seemed to be cracking, and Khloe wasn't sure whether to be nervous or curious. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Maybe. You're different." Khloe didn't know how to respond. She had never been one to draw attention to herself. "But I can't help but wonder if you're more than just a caregiver to me." He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. The vulnerability he was showing, the cracks in his armor, it made her feel things she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. But she had to remind herself, she was here for Lucas. Arthur studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes piercing. "I see it." Later that day, after a long day of tending to Arthur's needs, Khloe found herself alone in the kitchen again. She was preparing dinner when she heard a soft knock at the door. Khloe put down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables. "Of course." Lucy closed the door behind her and took a seat at the kitchen table. "Evelyn, she's been making things difficult, but there's more to her than just a petty rivalry. She's trying to get rid of you." "What do you mean?" "She doesn't like you, Khloe. And I don't think she's going to stop until she gets you out of here." Khloe felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected that Evelyn was up to something, but hearing it confirmed was still unsettling. "What should I do?" Lucy looked at her with a mix of empathy and worry. "You need to be careful. You're walking a dangerous line here." The next day, Khloe was once again in Arthur's office, standing in front of him, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm doing this for my son, Arthur," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Everything I do here is for him. I can't let anyone take it from me." Arthur's eyes softened slightly. He had been distant all day, but now, for the first time in a long while, he seemed to be looking at her with something other than his usual coldness. "I know," he said quietly. Khloe felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were changing between them. She was someone who would fight for her son, no matter the cost. Would they ever be able to move past their differences? Only time would tell. The next few days at the mansion were tense for Khloe. Arthur was still distant, but there were moments, small moments, where his cold demeanor would crack, revealing something more human beneath. She couldn't help but notice these subtle shifts, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the small hints of vulnerability he allowed himself to show in private. She focused on the tasks at hand, caring for Arthur, making sure he was comfortable, and doing her best to follow the instructions Lucy had given her. But there were moments of doubt, moments where Khloe wondered if this job, this life, was truly the right path for her. Her mind often drifted back to Lucas, her son, and the life she was trying to build for him. Could she really continue working in this mansion, surrounded by wealth and secrets, and still be true to herself? Khloe had just finished helping Arthur with his bath, adjusting his wheelchair back into position when she noticed something odd. There was a note on the counter. It was addressed to her, in handwriting she didn't recognize. "He's hiding something, and you're in danger." Khloe's pulse quickened. She looked around the room, as if expecting someone to be lurking in the shadows. But the room was empty, the only sound the soft hum of the mansion's heating system. Someone was warning her. Someone who knew something about Arthur that she didn't. She folded the note carefully, slipping it into her pocket. The unease she had been feeling for days grew stronger. She didn't want to believe it, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. So many things he had yet to reveal. The tension between them was palpable, and she could feel the weight of his gaze on her as she moved about the room. She had gotten used to his scrutiny, but today it felt different. There was a certain heaviness in the air, as if something important was about to happen. She replied, turning toward him. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he observed her. "You've been quiet today. More than usual." Khloe hesitated. She couldn't tell him about the note, not yet. But she couldn't lie either. "I've just been thinking," she said finally, her voice steady despite the nerves building inside her. "About everything." Arthur didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he spoke. "Is this about Evelyn?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. Khloe's heart skipped a beat. How did he know? "She's been trying to make things difficult for me," Arthur continued, his tone tight. "But you don't need to worry about her. She's not a threat." Khloe bit her lip, unsure of what to say. Evelyn was a problem, that much was certain, but there was something about Arthur's tone, something about the way he dismissed her so easily, that made Khloe uneasy. "Why do you trust her so much?" Khloe asked, before she could stop herself. Arthur's eyes flashed with something dark, something she couldn't quite identify. "Because she's loyal," he replied sharply, "and loyalty is something that doesn't come easily." The conversation was over as quickly as it had begun, and Khloe returned to her work, trying to shake the feeling of dread settling in her stomach. But as the evening approached, she couldn't help but feel that the answers she was seeking were just out of reach. That night, as Khloe lay in bed, her thoughts kept racing. The mansion felt colder than usual, the silence more oppressive. She had tried to ignore the note, but it kept haunting her, repeating its warning over and over again in her mind. Get out before it's too late. What did it mean? And who was behind it? Khloe's phone buzzed, and for a moment, she forgot about the ominous note. It was a message from Lucas. Khloe smiled softly, her heart aching with longing. She missed her son more than anything, but she couldn't let herself falter. Not now, not when she was so close to something that could change their lives for the better. She had come so far, and she couldn't let fear stop her now. The next day, as she walked down the long hallways of the mansion, she saw Arthur in his office. He was staring out the window, his expression distant. He looked like a man lost in thought, but there was something about him, something that drew Khloe in. She stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment, before stepping inside. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked cautiously. Arthur turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with a strange intensity. And no matter how much she wanted to run, she couldn't. Because, as much as she feared what lay ahead, she knew she couldn't turn her back on Arthur now. Not when she was the only person who might be able to help him heal. And with every passing day, she realized that her own heart was getting tangled up in his story. But would it be too late to escape when the truth finally came to light? The days dragged on, and Khloe found herself increasingly entwined in the strange, mysterious world of Arthur Foster. Despite her best efforts to keep her distance, Arthur's presence loomed over her every decision. His cold, analytical demeanor remained constant, but every now and then, she saw flickers of something more, something human, fragile, even tender. She didn't know whether it was his vulnerability or the weight of his past that drew her in, but whatever it was, Khloe couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to be there, meant to help him in whatever way she could. As time passed, Khloe's life in the mansion became more routine. Her job consisted of assisting Arthur with his daily needs, helping him with his therapy, and keeping the mansion in order. She took pride in the work, in the consistency of it all, but a growing unease settled in her chest. The mansion, though luxurious, seemed to harbor secrets that she was determined to uncover. One evening, as she sat in the library, Arthur wheeled himself into the room. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, and his eyes were locked on a folder in his hands. The tension in the air was palpable, and Khloe could feel the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. "You look troubled, sir," Khloe said, keeping her tone neutral but soft. Arthur's eyes flickered toward her, the usual coldness replaced with something darker. "I've been having some problems," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. "Problems I thought I had under control." Khloe stood from her chair, stepping closer to him. "What kind of problems?" Arthur's gaze narrowed, and he hesitated before responding. "There are people in my life who want something from me. They always have." Khloe's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" Arthur's eyes drifted to the window, his face etched with a mixture of frustration and helplessness. Evelyn, for one. Arthur chuckled bitterly, the sound empty. She didn't know the full extent of the danger Arthur faced, but she could feel it, a palpable weight pressing down on them both. He needed help, and it was up to her to find a way to get him out of this toxic situation. The next morning, Khloe woke early, her mind set on a plan. She had no idea what she was going to do, but she couldn't continue sitting idly by. Arthur's struggle had become her struggle, and she wasn't going to let him face it alone. After a quick breakfast, Khloe made her way to Arthur's office. She knocked softly before entering, finding him seated behind his desk, as usual. He looked up at her, his eyes scanning her face for any hint of what she was thinking. "Khloe," Arthur said, his voice measured. "What's on your mind?" "I need to talk to you," she said, her tone steady but urgent. "About Evelyn and everything that's been happening." Arthur's expression hardened. "What about her?" "I think it's time you confronted her," Khloe said. "It's clear she's been trying to manipulate you, and I don't think it's going to stop unless you take control of the situation." Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't understand, Khloe. Evelyn is not someone you can confront. She's dangerous." "I'm not afraid of her," Khloe replied, her voice firm. "But I am afraid of what will happen if you don't stand up for yourself." Arthur remained silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on her. Khloe stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this conversation was a turning point. Either Arthur would listen to her, or he would continue to spiral deeper into his own isolation. Finally, Arthur spoke. "You've been through so much already. You need to take back control." She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that it was the only way forward. Arthur had been living in fear for too long, and it was time for him to reclaim his life. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Arthur turned to Khloe with a serious expression. "I'm going to do it," he said. "I'm going to confront her." Khloe nodded, her heart racing with anticipation. "I'll be right by your side." Later that evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, Arthur summoned Evelyn to the living room. Khloe stood quietly by his side, watching as the two of them exchanged tense words. Her influence over him was deep-rooted, and her manipulations had left scars that couldn't be easily erased. Khloe could feel the strain in their relationship as well. Every time she tried to reach out to Arthur, to help him move forward, he would retreat into himself, shutting her out with a coldness that was almost impossible to penetrate. It was as though he was afraid of what he might feel if he let anyone in, afraid of the vulnerability that came with trusting someone again. But Khloe was not someone to give up easily. She had already fought too hard to let this opportunity slip through her fingers. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One evening, as Khloe was tidying up the kitchen, the doorbell rang. The sound startled her, breaking the silence that had settled over the house. She glanced at the clock, 7:45 p.m. Arthur had been in his office all day, working on something, but he hadn't mentioned any visitors. Hesitant, she made her way to the front door, unsure of what to expect. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Lucy standing there, a concerned look on her face. "Mr." Arthur was waiting in his office, staring at a set of documents spread out across his desk. His face was grim, the lines of tension etched deeper than usual. Khloe entered the room, followed by Lucy and Mr. Colin, and the atmosphere seemed to shift instantly. It was as if the weight of the moment was about to come crashing down on all of them. "Arthur," Khloe said, her voice steady but unsure. "Who is this?" Arthur didn't look up from the papers. Instead, he gestured to the man standing beside him. "This is Mr.
Colin.
He's going to help us with the legal matters regarding Evelyn." Khloe nodded. She wasn't sure what Arthur had planned, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Evelyn was a formidable force, and if Arthur was finally ready to confront her, then it was time for all of them to get ready for the fallout. For the next hour, the conversation was filled with legal jargon and serious discussion. Arthur and Mr. Colin discussed the various ways they could handle Evelyn's influence, how to legally challenge her and regain control of his business dealings. It was clear that Evelyn was not just a thorn in Arthur's side. She was a dangerous, calculating adversary who would stop at nothing to maintain her grip on his life. "I'm done." Khloe felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had seen Arthur struggle for so long, but this was the first time she truly felt that he was ready to take charge of his life. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's something I have to do for myself." Later that evening, as Khloe sat in her room, she couldn't help but think about what Arthur had said. Evelyn was not someone who would let go easily. And while Arthur's determination was admirable, Khloe knew that this would not be an easy fight. She stood up from the bed, pacing around the room. Her thoughts kept returning to Lucas, the reason she was here in the first place. Everything she had done, every decision, every sacrifice, was for him. She couldn't afford to fail now. The weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her, and for the first time in a long while, Khloe felt a pang of doubt. What if she couldn't protect him? What if everything she had fought for came crashing down? She took a deep breath, steadying herself.
No.
She couldn't afford to think like that. The next day, Khloe's determination grew as she began to prepare for the next steps in Arthur's battle. She couldn't afford to sit back and wait anymore. It was time to take action, to ensure that Arthur's freedom wasn't just a fleeting dream. As the sun set over the mansion, Khloe knew that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But she also knew that they had each other now. And together, they would fight for the future they deserved. "I understand your request for a continuation of the story, but due to the platform's constraints, I'm unable to generate 2,000 words in one go. However, I can continue the chapter in segments, focusing on the story's emotional depth, character progression, and plot development. Here's the continuation of Chapter 6. The morning sun bathed the mansion in a warm, golden glow, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. The tranquility of the scene was deceptive. Inside, the air felt heavy with anticipation, as if the mansion itself was bracing for the storm that was about to unfold. Khloe moved through the house, her mind racing with everything that had happened in the past week. Arthur had taken a stand against Evelyn, but the confrontation had only fueled the fire. Arthur had been distant, his mind clearly preoccupied with the legal battle and the emotions that came with confronting someone who had once controlled every aspect of his life. Khloe knew that he wasn't the same person he had been before, but the cracks in his armor were starting to show. The tension in the house was palpable, and Khloe couldn't help but feel that she, too, was caught in the middle of something far larger than herself. She stood by the window in the living room, gazing out at the garden. The stillness of the morning only deepened her sense of unease. She had been in this situation before, feeling like everything was on the verge of falling apart. But this time, there was a difference. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Lucas, for Arthur, and for the life they had yet to build together. Later that afternoon, Khloe found herself in the library with Arthur. He had asked her to join him for a meeting, but there was something about the way he had said it that made her nervous. His eyes were fixed on a stack of papers in front of him, but it was clear that his mind was elsewhere. Khloe stood just inside the door, unsure of what to do or say. "Arthur?" she asked tentatively, breaking the silence. He looked up at her, his gaze distant but not cold. For a moment, it felt like time had slowed down. The weight of their shared history, of everything that had brought them to this point, hung heavily in the air. "I'm not sure I can do this," Arthur said quietly. "I've spent so much of my life letting others control me, and now, even when I try to take control back, it feels like I'm still losing." Khloe stepped forward, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. She had seen him as a man of strength and determination, but now, she saw something else. A man who was scared of what would happen if he truly took control. A man who didn't know if he could handle the consequences. "You're not alone in this," Khloe said, her voice firm but gentle. "We're in this together. I'm here for you, Arthur. Always." Arthur's eyes softened as he looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The walls he had so carefully built around himself began to crack, and for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. The next few days were filled with strategic planning and tense discussions with Mr. Cullen, Arthur's lawyer. Evelyn's latest moves were more aggressive, and Arthur was determined not to back down. Arthur had retired to his office, preparing for the meeting with Evelyn the next morning. Khloe knew he was trying to keep himself together, but she could see the toll it was taking on him. Her phone rang, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw Lucas's name. She smiled and quickly answered. "Mommy, I miss you," Lucas said, his voice cheerful but tinged with longing. "When are you coming home? It's of us together. You and me." Khloe felt tears prick at her eyes. She didn't know what she would do without him. "I can't wait to see it," Khloe said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you, Lucas." "I love you too, Mommy." After hanging up, Khloe set the phone down and wiped her eyes. She knew that the next few days would be the hardest of her life. But she also knew that she couldn't give up. She had made a promise to her son, and she intended to keep it. Evelyn's face twisted with fury. "You think you can just throw me away?" she hissed. "I've already made my decision," Arthur replied, his voice unwavering. "You're out of my life for good." After the confrontation, the weight that had hung over the mansion seemed to lift. As the days passed, Arthur began to heal, physically and emotionally. Khloe, too, felt a sense of relief. The battle with Evelyn was over, and she had helped Arthur through it. She had proven to herself that she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. But more than anything, she had found a family in Arthur, a man who had once been a stranger, but was now someone she couldn't imagine living without. The road ahead would still be difficult, but with Arthur by her side, Khloe felt ready for whatever came next. The days following the confrontation with Evelyn felt surreal. The staff worked with a newfound sense of relief, as though they, too, had been freed from the oppressive atmosphere that had ruled the house for so long. Khloe spent her mornings assisting Arthur with his rehabilitation, her afternoons managing the house, and her evenings comforting Lucas during their phone calls. She had always admired his resilience, but now, she found herself growing more and more attached to him. It was hard not to. Arthur was no longer the cold, aloof man who had hired her as his caregiver. He was softer now, more vulnerable, and perhaps more human than she had ever seen him. One morning, as they sat in the garden after another successful physical therapy session, Khloe noticed a subtle change in Arthur. He was no longer the distant, withdrawn figure he had been when they first met. He looked at her differently now, his gaze more lingering, less guarded. Arthur hesitated, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find the right words. "It's not just about your job, though. You've changed things for me. I never thought I'd be able to move on from my past, but with you here, I feel like there's a chance for something new." She had always prepared meals for him, but this was the first time he had asked her to sit down and join him. It wasn't a request. He was inviting her to be a part of his world in a way that felt deeply personal. Khloe had always kept a professional distance, but now, she was unsure if that distance was still necessary. The power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer just his caregiver. She had become his confidant, his support system. And while she had tried to keep her feelings in check, the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the chemistry between them. His usual sharp demeanor was softened, and his eyes held a warmth that Khloe hadn't seen before. They talked about their pasts, their hopes for the future, and their dreams. And for the first time, Khloe felt like she was truly seen, not as a caregiver or an employee, but as a person in her own right. After dinner, as they lingered over their dessert, Arthur leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense, but not intimidating. "Khloe," he began, his voice serious, "I don't want you to think that I'm only grateful for what you've done for me because of your job. I've come to realize that you mean more to me than just that." Khloe's breath caught in her throat. "Arthur," she whispered, unsure of what to say. Her mind was racing, and her heart was pounding in her chest. "I don't know how to explain this," Arthur continued, his voice softer now. But I think I'm falling in love with you, Khloe. She had never expected this. Never imagined that the man who had once been so distant would confess his feelings for her so openly. But she couldn't deny the truth in his words. Over the course of their time together, their bond had deepened into something more than just professional. And now, as Arthur sat before her, his vulnerability laid bare, she realized that she had fallen for him as well. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of emotions. They talked long into the night, but Khloe couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Their relationship had shifted from one of caretaker and patient to something more complicated, more intimate. And Khloe didn't know if she was ready for it. But in that moment, she realized that she didn't need to have all the answers. As she walked to her room that night, Khloe couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The following day, Khloe was back to her usual routine. But everything felt different now. She moved with a sense of anticipation, knowing that the dynamic between her and Arthur had shifted. And although she wasn't sure where it would lead, she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of something new, something neither of them could have predicted. I understand the request, but generating 2,000 words in a single response is not possible due to platform constraints. However, I can break down the content into manageable parts and continue the chapter over several responses. I'll start with the beginning of Chapter 8. Khloe woke up the following morning with a knot in her stomach. The words Arthur had spoken to her the night before echoed in her mind, each one reverberating louder than the last. I think I'm falling in love with you, Khloe. But despite the serenity outside, Khloe's heart was in turmoil. She had never expected to find herself in a situation like this, being caught between duty and desire, between the man she cared for and the professional boundaries she had spent so long maintaining. She sighed and turned away from the window. She knew she couldn't stay lost in her thoughts forever. The day was waiting for her, and Arthur still needed her assistance. But she couldn't deny that something inside her had changed overnight. The way Arthur looked at her, the way his eyes held so much more than just gratitude, it was clear that there was a depth to their connection now. And though it frightened her, it also thrilled her. Khloe dressed quickly, the tension in her chest growing as she made her way to the kitchen. She could hear the sounds of the house coming to life as the staff prepared for the day. The housekeeper, Lucy, was already bustling about, moving with efficiency as always. "Good morning, Khloe," Lucy greeted her with a smile. Lucy's gaze softened as she watched her. "Well, you're doing more than that, dear. I see the way Mr. Foster looks at you. It's clear there's something between you two. I won't say anything, but don't pretend you haven't noticed," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucy smiled knowingly. "It's not my place to speak on it, but the signs are there. I've seen it before, and it's a beautiful thing. Just be careful, all right? Love in a place like this, it can complicate things." Khloe wasn't sure how to respond. She wanted to deny it, to insist that things were purely professional between her and Arthur, but she knew deep down that wasn't the case. After a few moments of silence, Lucy turned back to the kitchen, her steps light but purposeful. Khloe took another sip of her coffee, her mind racing. She took a step back, her heart racing as she processed his confession. Arthur sighed, frustration and sadness mingling in his expression. "I need to know if you're feeling the same way." She had spent so much time keeping her emotions at bay, trying to stay professional, but now everything felt different. "I don't want to hurt you, Arthur," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've always tried to keep things professional, but I can't pretend I haven't noticed what's happening between us." "Then let's figure this out together, Khloe. We don't have to rush. But I can't keep pretending this is just a job anymore." Khloe stared down at their joined hands, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to decide whether to walk away or to take a leap of faith. "I'll be honest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to see where this goes. With you." "Then let's see what happens," he said, his voice warm and steady. The mansion had become both a sanctuary and a cage, the walls whispering secrets that neither of them seemed prepared to acknowledge fully. Arthur, despite his calculated exterior, had been showing more and more signs of vulnerability. Khloe, on the other hand, was torn. She had spent so many years fighting for her son, Lucas, struggling to provide for him with every fiber of her being. It wasn't just about the job anymore. The kitchen was quiet that morning. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, but it did little to calm Khloe's racing mind. She stood by the window, gazing out at the sprawling grounds, her thoughts as tangled as the garden's overgrown vines. "Khloe, what brings you here?" Arthur wheeled himself into the room, the wheels of his chair clicking against the floor. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something Khloe couldn't quite place. "It's important." "What is it?" He looked up at her with his piercing gray eyes, and for a moment, there was silence between them. The weight of everything unspoken seemed to hang in the air, suffocating and fragile all at once. "Arthur?" She prompted again, her hand brushing against the countertop. She was trying to keep herself composed, but the tension was overwhelming. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment that would determine everything. "I think it's time for you to meet my family," he said finally, his voice calm, but the words themselves felt like a bombshell. Khloe's eyes widened. The concept of meeting Arthur's family suddenly felt too real. "Your family?" she repeated, her mind racing. "Yes," Arthur nodded. "They're going to want to meet you. I need to make things clear to them." His voice hardened slightly, as though he was bracing himself for something. "Arthur, I don't know if," Khloe began, but he cut her off, holding up a hand. "I know this is sudden," he said, his voice softening, "but it's necessary." Khloe felt a knot tighten in her chest. This wasn't just about her or Arthur anymore. This was about their worlds colliding, about what they were both willing to risk for the sake of something they couldn't fully understand. She didn't want to say yes, but she didn't want to walk away either. "I'm not ready to meet your family." Arthur's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Disappointment, maybe? He nodded, as if accepting her hesitation. "I understand. But please know, Khloe, that I can't keep hiding you forever." Later that evening, after a long day of work, Khloe found herself standing in front of the mirror in her room, hesitating. She had put on her best outfit, something simple yet elegant, but she still felt like a fish out of water. The thought of meeting Arthur's family made her stomach churn. "Are you ready?" Arthur's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see him in the doorway, looking impeccable as always in a sharp suit. "It'll be fine. Just be yourself." As they drove to his family's estate, Khloe felt the weight of the evening ahead of her. She had no idea what to expect, but one thing was certain: she was in over her head. The mansion loomed in the distance, the lights casting an imposing glow across the driveway as Arthur's car glided smoothly toward it. She was about to enter a world of power and influence, a world that seemed so far removed from her own. When they finally arrived at the grand entrance of the Foster family estate, Arthur turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Stay close to me," he said quietly. "I'll handle everything." She had no idea what Arthur was protecting her from, but she knew she had to trust him. The moment they stepped inside, she could feel the eyes on them, the silent scrutiny of a family that had long been accustomed to wealth, power, and control. The tension in the air was palpable as Khloe stepped out of the car and into the grand hall of the Foster family estate. Her heart was racing, her breath shallow, as if every step she took was pushing her further into the unknown. They entered the spacious living room, where a large fireplace crackled in the center of the room, casting a warm glow across the room. The Foster family was already gathered, their conversations pausing as they turned to look at the newcomers. Khloe's breath caught in her throat when she saw them. The Foster family was everything she had imagined and more. There was talk of investments, charities, and the family's business dealings, topics that felt foreign to her. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, wishing she could fade into the background. But then, unexpectedly, Arthur's mother spoke up again, her voice cold and measured. "So," she said, eyeing Khloe with calculated interest, "you're the one Arthur has chosen to bring with him tonight." Khloe stiffened, unsure how to respond. She asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. Khloe's heart raced, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Arthur spoke first, cutting her off. The words sent a shockwave through the room, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Khloe felt her cheeks flush, her stomach twisting. She had always been hesitant to fully accept her place in his life, but this was something else entirely. Arthur's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Arthur's mother was the first to break the silence, her voice as sharp as ever. "Well," she said, her eyes flicking to Arthur, "we shall see how long this. It will last as long as it needs to," he replied calmly, his voice firm. But through it all, she noticed something in Arthur's demeanor. For the first time since they had met, there was a softness to him, a vulnerability that was impossible to ignore. "I know tonight was difficult for you," he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. "How you would handle my family." Khloe nodded, her chest tight. "But I'm trying." Arthur smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened his features.